The damp, metallic smell of the cage was something Lyra had grown used to. For years, she had woken up to the same dim light filtering through the cracks in the cold, gray walls of the alien outpost. The faint hum of machinery and distant echoes of guards' footsteps were her only company. She sat quietly in the corner, her pale blue skin marked by scars from the past, her white hair dull from years of neglect. Hope was a foreign concept now, something she had long abandoned. Lyra stared at the rusted bars, her delicate hands wrapped around her knees. She wasn't the only prisoner in this underground labyrinth, but the others were mere shadows, their spirits as broken as hers. The guards treated them all as nothing more than objects, prisoners with no future. Far above, under the cover of a cloudy night, Eliant Draven crouched near the edge of a cliff overlooking the alien facility. A veteran human warrior, he had seen many battles, but this mission felt different. The intel he had received spoke of a hidden prison, a place where the cruel kept their captives locked away for experimentation or worse. Eliant adjusted the visor on his helmet, scanning the terrain for weak points. The facility was heavily guarded, with patrol drones circling above and armed guards stationed at every entrance. But Eliant wasn't one to back down from a challenge. He took a deep breath, the cool night air calming his nerves. "This is no ordinary prison," he murmured, his sharp eyes narrowing as he mapped out his approach. Inside the labyrinth, Lyra closed her eyes and leaned her head against the cold wall. Her memories were fragmented now, blurred by the weight of time. Once she had been free, living in a peaceful world surrounded by her people. But that life had been stolen from her when she was betrayed and handed over to the enemy. She had tried to escape once, long ago. The scars on her wrists were a reminder of the failed attempt. Since then, she had resigned herself to this existence, a prisoner waiting for an end that never came. Suddenly, a faint tremor ran through the floor beneath her. Her eyes opened, startled. It wasn't unusual for the facility to vibrate. Machines worked constantly here, but this felt different. It was subtle, almost as if something or someone was moving through the labyrinth. Farther down the dark corridors, Eliant slipped past a pair of guards. His movements were silent, his training as a human warrior evident in every step. He had memorized the schematics of the facility, knowing precisely where to go. The prison cells were deep underground, hidden behind layers of security, but he was determined to reach them. As he turned a corner, he saw the first row of cells. Each one was small and dark, with weak figures huddled inside. Eliant's jaw tightened as he saw their hopeless expressions. He knew he couldn't save everyone here, but he had to try. Lyra heard the faint sound of footsteps outside her cell and tensed. She thought it was just another guard making rounds, but then the footsteps stopped. She looked up, her tired eyes meeting the silhouette of someone she didn't recognize. Eliant stood before her cell, his helmet reflecting the dim light. He scanned her briefly, noting her frail appearance. Something about her drew his attention, though he couldn't explain why. "I'm here to get you out," he said quietly, his voice steady and firm. Lyra blinked, unsure if she had imagined it. For years, no one had spoken to her like this, with purpose and determination. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Eliant quickly worked on the lock, using a small device to disable it. As the door creaked open, he extended his hand toward her. "Come on," he urged. "We don't have much time." Lyra hesitated, staring at his hand. For the first time in years, a small flicker of something stirred inside her. Hope. Lyra's fingers trembled as she reached out to take Eliant's hand. His grip was firm but gentle, a contrast to the cold metal bars that had caged her for so long. For a moment, she hesitated. Could she really trust him? Was this a trap, another cruel game by her captors? But there was something in his voice, a certainty that pierced through her doubts. "Move quietly," Eliant whispered, his eyes scanning the corridor behind them. "And stay close to me." Lyra nodded, her voice still locked away by years of silence. She followed him, her bare feet making almost no sound against the cold floor. The dim lights flickered above them, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Her heart pounded in her chest, each step feeling like a leap into the unknown. Eliant led her through a series of winding passages. The facility was a maze, but he moved with purpose, guided by the blueprints he had memorized. Every now and then, he would pause, listening for the faint hum of approaching guards or the telltale whir of surveillance drones. His sharp instincts had kept him alive through countless missions, and they weren't about to fail him now. Behind him, Lyra struggled to keep up. Her body was weak, years of malnutrition and confinement taking their toll. She stumbled once, catching herself against the wall. Eliant turned back immediately, concern flickering in his eyes. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice softer now. She nodded, though she wasn't sure if it was true. "I'll manage," she whispered, her voice hoarse from disuse. Eliant gave her a small nod of encouragement. "We're almost to the maintenance shafts. Once we're in, they'll have a harder time tracking us." As they moved deeper into the labyrinth, the sound of footsteps echoed in the distance. Eliant froze, holding up a hand to signal Lyra to stop. He pressed himself against the wall, pulling her with him into the shadows. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied by guttural voices speaking in a harsh alien language. 2 guards appeared around the corner, their weapons slung over their shoulders. Eliant's hand hovered near the hilt of his blade, but he didn't move. He waited, his body tense, his breath steady. Lyra held her own breath, her wide eyes fixed on the approaching guards. The guards stopped a few feet away, their conversation punctuated by bursts of laughter. One of them glanced down the corridor, but didn't seem to notice the pair hidden in the shadows. After a moment, they continued on, their voices fading into the distance. Eliant exhaled quietly, motioning for Lyra to follow him. "That was close," he murmured. They reached the entrance to the maintenance shafts, a narrow opening hidden behind a panel. Eliant pried it open, revealing a dark, cramped tunnel lined with pipes and wires. He gestured for Lyra to go first. "It's a tight fit, but it's our best shot at avoiding detection," he said. Lyra hesitated, staring into the dark tunnel. "What if they find us in there?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "They won't," Eliant assured her. "I'll make sure of it." His confidence was infectious, and Lyra found herself nodding. She climbed into the shaft, her movements slow and careful. Eliant followed, pulling the panel closed behind them. The darkness enveloped them, broken only by the faint glow of the small flashlight Eliant carried. They crawled through the narrow space, the sound of their breathing mingling with the occasional creak of the metal around them. Lyra's arms and legs ached, but she pushed on, driven by the memory of Eliant's words. She wasn't sure why he had come for her, but for the first time in years, she dared to believe in the possibility of freedom. As they reached a fork in the tunnel, Eliant paused to check his map. "We're making progress," he said quietly. "Just a little further, and we'll be near the surface." But before they could move, a faint peeping sound echoed through the shaft. Eliant's face darkened. "They've activated the tracking drones," he said grimly. "They know someone's escaped." Lyra's heart sank. "What do we do?" she whispered. Eliant turned to her, his expression unwavering. "We keep moving. No matter what happens, I'll get you out of here. I promise." And for the first time in years, Lyra felt something stir within her, hope, fragile but real. Together, they pressed on, their journey far from over. The faint beeping from the tracking drones grew louder, echoing through the tight maintenance shaft. Eliant's sharp eyes scanned the narrow tunnel ahead, his grip tightening on the small weapon holstered at his side. Lyra crawled behind him, her breathing uneven as fear clawed at her mind. The dark tunnel felt like it was closing in, and the sound of their pursuers made every movement feel heavier. "Keep moving," Eliant urged, his voice low but firm. "We're running out of time." Lyra nodded, though she wasn't sure if her body could keep up. Her arms and legs burned with exhaustion, but she pushed forward. The thought of being dragged back to that cage was more terrifying than the narrow space around her. Suddenly, a red light flickered in the distance behind them. Lyra turned her head, her eyes widening as she spotted the first drone entering the shaft. It was small but menacing, its sleek metal frame equipped with blinking sensors and sharp pincers. A faint hum of energy surrounded it, and Lyra knew it wasn't just a tracker, it was built to kill. "They're here," she gasped, panic lacing her voice. Eliant twisted his body to glance back, his jaw tightening. "Stay low," he commanded, pulling a small device from his belt. It was a compact EMP grenade, designed to disable electronics. He pressed a button, activating the grenade, and threw it down the tunnel. The drone advanced closer, its sensors locking onto them, just as the grenade detonated with a burst of static. The drone's lights flickered and died, its body clattering to the floor. Lyra flinched at the sound, but relief washed over her when she realized the threat was neutralized. "That won't stop them for long," Eliant said, his tone grim. "More will come." They resumed crawling, moving faster now despite the cramped conditions. The tunnel twisted and turned, forcing them to maneuver carefully. Eliant's flashlight illuminated the way, but Lyra's mind raced with questions. Why had this human risked so much for her? She wanted to ask but couldn't find the words. Minutes felt like hours as they pressed on. The tunnel opened into a larger maintenance room, filled with tangled wires, broken equipment, and faint beams of light filtering through a grated ceiling. Eliant climbed out first, scanning the room for threats before helping Lyra up. "We need to reach the surface," he said, his voice steady. "Once we're out of this facility, I have a ship waiting. But this is where it gets dangerous." As if on cue, the sound of heavy boots echoed from a nearby corridor. The guards were closing in. Eliant motioned for Lyra to stay behind him as he drew his weapon, a compact plasma pistol. His movements were calculated, his focus razor-sharp. Lyra pressed herself against the wall, her heart pounding as the guards entered the room. They were tall, armored beings with reptilian features, their weapons glinting under the faint light. The leader barked orders in their guttural language, and the group fanned out, searching for them. Eliant didn't wait. He fired a precise shot, taking out one guard instantly. Chaos erupted as the others opened fire, their plasma bolts searing through the air. Lyra covered her ears, the noise deafening. Eliant moved like a shadow, dodging and retaliating with unerring accuracy. "Get to the other side," he shouted, pointing to a narrow vent. "I'll cover you." Lyra hesitated, fear rooting her to the spot. But as another plasma bolt struck near her feet, she snapped into action. Crawling toward the vent, she squeezed through, her heart racing. Eliant followed soon after, his movements swift despite the chaos behind him. The vent led to another shaft, this one sloping upward. Fresh air faintly drifted down, a promise of freedom. Lyra looked back at Eliant, her eyes filled with questions. He met her gaze and nodded. "We're almost there," he said, "but we can't stop now." As they climbed, the sound of the guards faded, but neither of them dared to relax. The facility wasn't going to let them go easily. For the first time in years, Lyra felt a spark of determination. She wasn't going to let them take her back, not after coming this far. With Eliant leading the way, she pressed on, the promise of freedom pulling her forward like a lifeline. The faint scent of fresh air grew stronger as Lyra and Eliant climbed the sloping shaft. The dim glow from above was the closest thing to sunlight she had seen in years, and it filled her with a mixture of hope and fear. Every inch closer to freedom felt like a triumph, but the sound of distant voices and heavy footsteps reminded her that dangers still lurked behind them. "Keep moving," Eliant urged, his voice steady but tense. "We're not out of this yet." Lyra nodded, her breath labored as her weak body fought to keep up. Her hands and knees ached from the climb, but she didn't dare slow down. The memory of the cage, the cold metal bars, and the years of silence pushed her forward. She couldn't go back. Not now. As they reached the top of the shaft, Eliant paused, peering through a grated cover. The view beyond revealed an open courtyard surrounded by towering walls and armed guards patrolling in pairs. Hovering drones buzzed in the air, their sensors sweeping the area. A large gate loomed on the far side, their only way out. Eliant's sharp eyes scanned the scene, calculating their next move. "We'll need a distraction," he muttered to himself. Lyra crouched beside him, her voice shaky but determined. What can I do to help?" Eliant glanced at her, surprised by the question. He could see the exhaustion in her pale blue face, but also the spark of courage in her eyes. He handed her a small device, a signal jammer, and quickly explained its use. "Plant this near that control panel," he said, pointing to a console near the gate. "It'll disable the drones for a short time. I'll handle the guards." Lyra hesitated, the weight of the task sinking in. She had never been part of a fight before, never taken risks beyond her own survival. But something in Eliant's confidence reassured her. She nodded, clutching the device tightly. "Wait for my signal," he said, his voice firm. "And be careful." With that, Eliant pushed open the grate and dropped into the courtyard, landing silently behind a stack of crates. He moved like a shadow, his weapon ready as he approached the nearest pair of guards. In a swift, calculated motion, he took them down without a sound. Lyra watched from the shaft, her heart racing. When Eliant waved for her to move, she swallowed her fear and climbed out. Keeping low, she crept along the perimeter, her every step feeling like a gamble. The cold metal of the device pressed against her palm, a reminder of her role in their escape. Eliant engaged another group of guards, drawing their attention with precision shots. The sound of gunfire echoed through the courtyard, alarms blaring to signal the breach. Drones swarmed toward him, their sensors locking onto his position. But Eliant didn't falter, his movements quick and deliberate as he led the chaos away from Lyra. Lyra reached the control panel, her fingers fumbling with the jammer. The loud alarms and flashing lights made her hands shake, but she forced herself to focus. As she activated the device, a surge of static erupted, and the drones above sputtered and fell from the sky. Eliant grinned as the drones dropped, his job made slightly easier. But the reinforcements were relentless, pouring into the courtyard like a flood. He fired relentlessly, his energy reserves dwindling, but his resolve unshaken. "Lyra, get to the gate," he shouted, his voice cutting through the noise. Lyra turned, her breath hitching as she saw Eliant pinned down by a wave of guards. For a moment, she froze, torn between running for her freedom and helping the man who had risked everything for her. "Go," he yelled again, his eyes locking onto hers. "I'll be right behind you." Summoning every ounce of courage, Lyra sprinted toward the gate. Her legs burned, and her chest ached. But she didn't stop. She reached the gate's controls and slammed her hand onto the release lever. The massive doors creaked open, revealing the wilderness beyond, a vast expanse of freedom. Eliant fought his way toward her, his movements a blur of strength and determination. When he finally reached her, his armor was scorched, and his face was streaked with sweat, but his eyes burned with triumph. "Let's go," he said, grabbing her hand. Together, they ran through the open gate, leaving the chaos of the courtyard behind. The alarms faded as they entered the forest beyond, the towering trees swallowing them in shadows. For the first time, Lyra felt the cool breeze of freedom on her face, and it was more exhilarating than she had ever imagined. But their escape wasn't over yet. The pursuit had only just begun. The dense forest swallowed Lyra and Eliant as they ran, their footsteps muffled by the thick undergrowth. The cool breeze brushed against Lyra's face, a stark contrast to the suffocating air of the prison she had known for years. She stumbled slightly, her body still weak, but Eliant's firm grip on her arm kept her steady. "Keep going," he urged, his voice low but commanding. "They'll send patrols after us. We need to put as much distance as we can." Behind them, faint shouts and the hum of search drones grew louder. The alien guards were relentless, and the thought of being recaptured sent a cold chill down Lyra's spine. She forced her legs to move faster, ignoring the burning pain in her muscles. The forest grew darker as the canopy thickened, the towering trees creating a natural shield from the drones above. Eliant led the way, his sharp instincts guiding them through the maze of greenery. He paused occasionally to check their surroundings, his keen eyes scanning for signs of pursuit. As they reached a small clearing, Eliant stopped, his chest heaving. "We need to rest for a moment," he said, glancing at Lyra. "You're barely holding on." Lyra leaned against a tree, her breath coming in short gasps. "I'm fine," she insisted, though her trembling hands betrayed her words. Eliant crouched beside her, pulling a small flask from his pack. "Drink," he said, handing it to her. "You need your strength." She took the flask and drank greedily, the cool water soothing her dry throat. "Why? Why did you come for me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't even know me." Eliant's gaze softened, but his tone remained firm. "Because no one deserves to be locked away like that. I've seen too many suffer in cages. If I can save one person, I will." Lyra looked at him, her pale blue eyes searching his face for any hint of doubt. All she saw was determination. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe in his words. The moment of quiet was short-lived. A distant whirring sound reached their ears, growing louder with each passing second. Eliant's expression hardened as he stood, pulling Lyra to her feet. "They've sent trackers," he said grimly. "We have to move. Now." They plunged deeper into the forest, the terrain growing rougher with each step. The sound of drones closing in made Lyra's heart race. She stumbled again, but Eliant caught her, his strength unwavering. "We're almost there," he said, his voice steady. "There's a cave system up ahead. It'll give us some cover." The forest began to thin, and the ground sloped downward. Ahead, a jagged rock formation came into view, its entrance partially hidden by vines. Eliant guided Lyra inside, the darkness of the cave enveloping them. The sound of drones grew deafening as they hovered just outside. Eliant motioned for Lyra to stay quiet, his hand resting on the hilt of his weapon. The drone's lights scanned the area, their sensors searching for any sign of movement. Lyra held her breath, her heart pounding so loudly she feared it would give them away. Minutes passed like hours, but eventually, the hum of the drones faded as they moved away. Eliant exhaled slowly, his tense shoulders relaxing slightly. "They'll keep searching," he said, his voice low. "But this should buy us some time." Lyra sank to the ground, her body trembling from exhaustion and fear. "How can you stay so calm?" she asked, her voice shaking. "They'll never stop hunting us." Eliant crouched beside her, his gaze steady. "Because I've been in worse situations," he said, "and I'd learned one thing. Fear only wins if you let it. We're not done fighting yet." Lyra looked at him, the weight of his words settling in her chest. Despite the danger, she felt a flicker of hope. This human warrior had risked everything to save her, and his unyielding resolve gave her strength she didn't know she had. As they sat in the dark cave, the sounds of the forest outside slowly returned, the faint chirping of insects and rustling leaves replacing the mechanical hum of drones. For now, they were safe, but both of them knew that the real battle was far from over. The darkness of the cave was cold and silent, wrapping Lyra and Eliant like a protective cloak. Outside, the faint hum of search drones had disappeared, but neither dared to fully relax. The rocky walls around them felt both like a sanctuary and a trap, a temporary shield against their relentless pursuers. Eliant crouched near the entrance, his weapon ready, scanning the forest for any signs of movement. His breathing was calm, but his sharp eyes missed nothing. Lyra sat on a smooth rock deeper in the cave, her pale blue hands tracing the cracks in the stone as she tried to steady herself. "You've done well," Eliant said without turning to look at her. His voice was firm but carried a trace of warmth. "Most wouldn't have made it this far." Lyra blinked, surprised by his words. "I've done nothing. You're the one keeping us alive." Eliant glanced back, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. You didn't give up. That's more important than you think. His words stirred something deep inside her, a flicker of pride she hadn't felt in years. She had been a prisoner for so long that she had forgotten what it meant to fight, to push back against the impossible. For the first time, she began to believe she might be stronger than she thought. Eliant returned to her side, kneeling to inspect a small wound on her arm she hadn't even noticed. The scrape from the sharp rocks in the forest had left a thin trail of dried blood. He pulled a small med kit from his pack and gently began cleaning the injury. Why do you care so much? Lyra asked, her voice soft. You've risked everything for someone you don't know. Eliant's hands paused for a moment before he continued. Because I've seen what happens when no one does. I've seen what these people do to those they capture. I couldn't stand by and let it happen again. His words were heavy, filled with unspoken memories. Lyra watched him carefully, noticing the way his jaw tightened as he worked. This wasn't just a mission for him, it was personal. As Eliant finished tending to her wound, the faint sound of water dripping echoed deeper within the cave. Lyra's gaze drifted toward the darkness, curiosity sparking in her tired mind. What's back there? She asked. Eliant followed her gaze. Not sure. But caves like this often have more than one entrance. If we're lucky, there might be another way out. He stood, his weapon slung over his shoulder, and gestured for her to follow. Stay close. The deeper they ventured into the cave, the cooler the air became. The walls glistened faintly with moisture, and the floor was uneven, forcing them to tread carefully. Lyra stayed close to Eliant, her trust in him growing with each step. After several minutes, they entered a large chamber illuminated by a soft, natural light filtering through cracks in the ceiling. In the center of the chamber was a small pool of crystal-clear water, its surface rippling gently. The sight was breathtaking, a moment of serenity in the chaos of their escape. Lyra approached the pool, kneeling beside it. For a moment, she saw her reflection, her pale blue skin, the tired lines on her face, and the scars that told her story. But as she looked closer, she saw something else. Strength. The woman staring back at her wasn't just a prisoner anymore. Eliant watched her silently, his arms crossed. We'll rest here for a bit, he said, breaking the silence. But not too long. They'll figure out we're hiding soon enough. Lyra nodded, dipping her hands into the cool water. It felt refreshing, a small comfort in their perilous journey. Do you think we can really get out of this? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Eliant crouched beside her, his expression serious but not without hope. I don't think. I know. I've survived worse, and so will you. His confidence was unwavering, and Lyra found herself believing him. Together, they drank from the pool and gathered their strength. The cave had given them a brief reprieve, but both knew it wouldn't last. The guards would come, and when they did, they had to be ready. As they prepared to move on, Lyra looked at Eliant, a new determination shining in her pale blue eyes. I won't slow you down again, she said firmly. Eliant smiled faintly. I never thought you did. With renewed resolve, they left the chamber, heading deeper into the unknown. The pursuit wasn't over, but for the first time, they both felt something stronger than fear, hope. The quiet of the cave was deceptive, hiding the dangers that lurked just outside. As Lyra and Eliant moved deeper into the tunnels, the air grew cooler and the light dimmed further. Their footsteps echoed softly against the stone walls, the sound a constant reminder of how vulnerable they were. Eliant led the way, his sharp eyes scanning for signs of another exit. His weapon was drawn, ready for any threats. Behind him, Lyra followed closely, her newfound determination propelling her forward despite the lingering exhaustion in her limbs. The cave took a sharp turn, opening into another chamber. This one was smaller than the last, but filled with jagged stalagmites and pools of still water. Eliant paused, holding up a hand to signal Lyra to stop. His instincts told him something wasn't right. "Stay here," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Lyra nodded, crouching behind a cluster of rocks as Eliant moved forward. He stepped carefully, his boots making almost no sound on the uneven ground. His eyes swept the chamber, searching for movement, for anything that might hint at danger. Then he saw it, a faint shimmer in the air, almost imperceptible but unmistakable. A trap. Eliant's heart quickened as he realized the alien guards had anticipated their escape route. Before he could warn Lyra, a sudden burst of energy filled the chamber. A blinding light erupted from the walls, and a deafening hum echoed through the cave. Lyra gasped, covering her ears as the light faded to reveal a group of heavily armed alien guards stepping out from a concealed passage. Eliant reacted instantly. He dove behind a rock, firing his plasma pistol at the advancing guards. The bolts of energy struck one of them, sending the alien crashing to the ground. But there were too many. The guards returned fire, their weapons lighting up the chamber in bursts of blue and red. "Run!" Eliant shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. Lyra hesitated, fear freezing her in place. But when she saw Eliant holding off the guards alone, something inside her snapped. She couldn't leave him, not after everything he had done for her. Instead of running, she grabbed a sharp piece of rock from the ground and hurled it at one of the guards. It wasn't much, but it struck the alien in the face, momentarily distracting him. Eliant used the opening to take down another guard with a precise shot. "Lyra, go," he shouted again, his tone more urgent. This time, she listened. She sprinted toward the far end of the chamber, where another tunnel led deeper into the cave. Eliant covered her, his shots forcing the guards to scatter. As Lyra reached the tunnel entrance, she turned back to see Eliant pinned down behind a rock. The guards were closing in, their weapons trained on him. Her chest tightened with panic. "Eliant," she screamed, her voice echoing off the cave walls. He looked at her, his face calm despite the chaos. "Keep going," he yelled. "I'll catch up." But Lyra couldn't leave him. Summoning all her courage, she searched the ground for anything she could use. Her eyes landed on a damaged energy cell dropped by one of the fallen guards. Without thinking, she grabbed it and ran back toward the fight. Eliant's eyes widened as he saw her approach. "What are you doing?" he shouted. Lyra didn't answer. She threw the energy cell into the middle of the guards and ducked behind a rock. The cell exploded in a burst of light and sound, disorienting the aliens and giving Eliant the opening he needed. He sprang from his cover, taking down the remaining guards with a series of quick, precise shots. The last guard fell with a thud, and the chamber went silent once more. Eliant turned to Lyra, his expression a mix of relief and frustration. "I told you to run," he said, his tone sharp but not unkind. Lyra met his gaze, her pale blue eyes unwavering. "And leave you to die?" "No." For a moment, they stared at each other, the weight of the moment hanging between them. Then Eliant sighed, a small smile breaking through his stern demeanor. "You're braver than I thought," he said, his voice softer now. Lyra smiled faintly, her heart still racing. "I had a good teacher." Eliant helped her to her feet, his grip steady. "Come on. We need to move before reinforcements arrive." Together, they left the chamber, their bond stronger than ever. The path ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, they felt like a true team, united against the odds. "You said." The cave opened into a steep, rocky valley bathed in the faint light of dawn. The fresh air was a stark contrast to the stifling darkness of the cave, but the respite was short-lived. In the distance, the distinct hum of engines grew louder, signaling the arrival of reinforcements. The alien guards weren't giving up. Eliant scanned the horizon, his jaw tightening as he spotted a transport vehicle descending from the cliffs above. Its sleek, black frame reflected the rising sun, and its weapons gleamed ominously. Behind him, Lyra struggled to steady her breathing, her body weary from the relentless chase. "We're out of time," Eliant said, his voice calm but urgent. He pointed to a narrow ridge that led toward the forest. "If we can reach those trees, we'll have better cover. But they'll be on us before we get there." Lyra looked at him, her pale blue face etched with determination. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. Eliant turned to her, his gaze unwavering. "You run," he said simply. "I'll hold them off." Her eyes widened in disbelief. "No, you can't fight them alone. I can buy you time," Eliant insisted, his tone firm. "If they catch us both, it's over. But if you make it to the forest, you'll have a chance." Lyra shook her head, her white hair falling across her face. "I won't leave you," she said, her voice breaking. Eliant softened, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Lyra, you're stronger than you think. You've made it this far. Don't let it be for nothing." Before she could argue further, the transport vehicle landed with a loud thud, kicking up a cloud of dust. The rear hatch opened, and a squad of heavily armed guards poured out, their weapons raised. Eliant pushed Lyra toward the ridge. "Go," he barked, his voice cutting through the chaos. Lyra hesitated for only a moment before obeying. She ran, her feet pounding against the rocky ground as she made her way toward the forest. Behind her, the sound of gunfire erupted, and she glanced back to see Eliant engaging the guards. He moved with precision, every shot finding its mark. The guards were relentless, but Eliant held his ground, using the terrain to his advantage. Lyra's heart ached as she watched him fight, his figure a lone shield against the onslaught. As she neared the ridge, she stumbled, her weakened legs nearly giving out. But she forced herself to keep moving, the thought of Eliant's sacrifice pushing her forward. The edge of the forest was so close, the trees like a beacon of hope. Suddenly, a loud explosion shook the ground, and Lyra turned to see smoke rising from Eliant's position. Her heart dropped. "Eliant," she screamed, her voice echoing across the valley. But then, through the haze of smoke, she saw him. Eliant emerged, bloody but alive, his weapon still in hand. He limped toward her, his face pale but his eyes fierce. "Keep going," he shouted, his voice hoarse but resolute. Lyra ran back toward him, her fear replaced by a surge of determination. She reached his side and threw his arm over her shoulders, supporting his weight as they moved toward the forest together. "You're stubborn," Eliant muttered, a faint smile breaking through his pain. "So are you," Lyra replied, her voice steady. The forest welcomed them with open arms, its dense canopy shielding them from the prying eyes of the drones above. The sound of the guards faded as they pressed deeper into the trees, their steps guided by sheer willpower. When they finally stopped, Eliant collapsed against a tree, his breathing ragged. Lyra knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she inspected his injuries. "You saved me," she said, her voice filled with gratitude and sorrow. Eliant looked at her, his expression soft despite the pain. "You saved yourself," he said. "I just gave you the chance." Lyra's pale blue eyes glistened with unused tears. "We'll make it," she said, her voice firm. "Together." Eliant nodded, a faint smile on his lips. "Together," he echoed. Though the battle wasn't over, they had survived another day. The forest would be their refuge, and together, they would face whatever came next. The forest was quiet now, its dense canopy shielding Eliant and Lyra from the chaos they had escaped. Sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting dappled patterns on the ground. Lyra knelt beside Eliant, her pale blue hands trembling as she pressed a cloth against a wound on his arm. His injuries were severe, but his eyes were still sharp, watching their surroundings. "You should rest," Lyra said softly, her voice filled with worry. Eliant shook his head, his expression resolute. "We're not safe yet. They'll send patrols into the forest." Lyra frowned but didn't argue. She knew he was right. The alien guards weren't the kind to give up easily, especially not after the chaos they had caused. But seeing Eliant like this, wounded and exhausted, made her chest tighten. She owed him her life, and she wouldn't let his sacrifice be in vain. As she worked to bandage his wounds, her mind raced with thoughts of their next move. The forest offered cover, but it wouldn't hide them forever. They needed a plan, a way to outsmart their relentless pursuers. "We can't keep running forever," Lyra said, her voice steady despite the fear in her heart. "Do you have a way out of here?" Eliant nodded weakly. "There's a pickup point, a small clearing a few kilometers from here. My ship is cloaked there. If we can reach it, we'll be safe." Lyra's heart lifted slightly at the mention of the ship. It was their ticket to freedom, to a life beyond the cage she had lived in for so long. But the journey to the clearing would be dangerous, especially with Eliant in his current state. "Then we'll make it," Lyra said firmly. "You've done enough for me. Now it's my turn to get us there." Eliant gave her a faint smile, his eyes filled with gratitude. "You're stronger than you know, Lyra." She helped him to his feet, his arm draped over her shoulders for support. Though his steps were unsteady, his determination mirrored her own. Together, they moved through the forest, their pace slow but purposeful. The sounds of the forest surrounded them, rustling leaves, distant bird calls, but every crack of a branch made them tense, fearing it was the guards. As they pressed on, Lyra felt a strange sense of clarity. The woman who had once been a prisoner, trapped in a cold, dark cage, was now leading the way. Every step was a defiance of the life she had been forced to endure. For the first time in years, she felt alive. After what felt like hours, they reached the edge of a small clearing. Eliant motioned for her to stop, his sharp instincts taking over. He scanned the area, his weapon ready, before nodding. "It's clear," he said. Lyra stepped forward, her breath catching as she saw it. A sleek, silver spacecraft hidden beneath the natural camouflage of the trees. Its design was unlike anything she had ever seen, a perfect blend of human ingenuity and practicality. "We made it," she whispered, her voice filled with awe. Eliant managed a weak smile. "Not yet. Let's get aboard." They approached the ship, and Eliant pressed a button on his wrist device. The ship's hatch opened with a quiet hiss, revealing a compact but efficient interior. Lyra helped him inside, guiding him to his seat as the hatch closed behind them. Eliant activated the ship's systems, his movements slower than usual but steady. The hum of the engine filled the cabin, a sound that promised safety. As the ship lifted off the ground, Lyra looked out the window, watching the forest shrink beneath them. For the first time in years, she felt the weight of her captivity lift. She turned to Eliant, her voice steady. "Thank you. For everything." Eliant leaned back in his seat, his face pale but his expression calm. "You don't have to thank me. You deserved a chance to be free." Lyra smiled, her pale blue eyes glistening with tears. "And now you're free too." The ship soared into the sky, leaving the dangers behind. For Lyra and Eliant, the journey wasn't over, but the hardest part was behind them. Together, they had defied the odds, forging a bond stronger than fear. As the stars came into view, Lyra made a silent promise to herself. She would never be a prisoner again.